In episode 69, Crush Exam Day with Calm, Repeatable Tactics, the focus shifts from content to execution, from what you know to how you use it under pressure. For an exam candidate, nerves are inevitable, but a well-rehearsed routine can turn that energy into steady forward motion. The goal is to walk into the testing center with a mental playbook you have already practiced, not a collection of vague hopes. Exam day then becomes less about surviving a stressful event and more about running a familiar, reliable process. When that process is clear in your mind, confidence comes from rhythm rather than bravado. One of the simplest but most powerful habits is arriving early enough that logistics never become the first crisis of the day. A candidate who shows up with time to spare can move through identification checks, locker assignments, and policy confirmations without feeling rushed or defensive. This calm check-in experience reduces the sense of being on trial before the exam even starts and leaves mental space for reviewing pacing plans or breathing techniques. It also allows time to absorb the environment, from noise levels to lighting, so there are fewer surprises once the clock starts. When logistics feel controlled and predictable, cognitive resources stay available for reading and reasoning instead of reacting. From the first question, pacing becomes the backbone of your execution strategy, and a two-pass triage method gives that pacing structure. On the first pass, the intention is to answer all questions that are clear, familiar, and solvable within a short time frame, marking anything that looks lengthy or uncertain. This approach avoids getting stuck early on a single complex scenario, while easy points remain untouched further ahead. The second pass is reserved for the marked questions, where you can invest more time and attention without jeopardizing completion of the exam. Over time, this two-pass rhythm becomes a reliable way to manage both the clock and your own tendency to overwork a single problem. Reading discipline at the question level begins with the stem, not the answer options, so that your mind anchors to the actual problem. Focusing on the verbs in the stem, such as prioritize, select, mitigate, or justify, clarifies what kind of response is being requested, whether strategic, procedural, or evaluative. Constraints, such as budget limits, regulatory requirements, or organizational maturity, narrow the range of plausible answers before options even appear. Explicit stakeholder priorities, like protecting cardholder data, preserving service continuity, or satisfying an acquiring bank, signal which risk trade-offs matter most. When the stem is unpacked carefully, the answer choices are easier to judge against a clear intent rather than a vague impression. Eliminating distractors systematically reduces cognitive load and increases the odds of landing on the best option. Many distractors rely on absolutes like always or never that rarely fit complex governance or risk decisions, especially in payment environments. Others tempt with edge cases that might be technically possible but are unsupported by the scenario or inconsistent with stated constraints. By checking each option against the stem's verbs, constraints, and stakeholder priorities, it becomes easier to rule out answers that solve the wrong problem or ignore key details. What remains may still require judgment, but the field is narrower and closer to the correct reasoning path. Choosing the best answer often involves accepting that more than one option looks plausible, especially in governance and risk scenarios. In those moments, the question becomes which choice aligns most closely with the organization's mission, risk appetite, and formal governance structures. Answers that preserve traceability, evidence, and defensible decision-making usually outperform those that chase quick technical wins with weak documentation. Similarly, options that honor regulatory obligations and cardholder data protections will tend to be favored over purely cost-driven responses. When uncertainty remains, leaning toward decisions that are explainable, auditable, and consistent with prior episodes' principles can guide you to the most exam-aligned choice. Time management benefits from explicit time boxes and a willingness to move on from sinkhole questions. A candidate who notices that several minutes have passed without real progress on a single item can acknowledge the stall, flag the question, and return to easier ground. This is not surrender. It is an intentional choice to protect the overall score by ensuring that straightforward points are not left on the table. Later in the exam, recovered minutes can be reinvested into those flagged items with a fresh perspective and a broader sense of how the exam is structured. Treating time as a resource to allocate rather than a constant source of pressure keeps decisions rational rather than reactive. Maintaining performance over several hours requires periodic mental resets, even if they are brief and subtle. Simple actions like closing the eyes for a moment, taking a few slow breaths, or stretching wrists and shoulders can interrupt the buildup of tension. These resets counter tunnel vision, where the mind becomes locked on patterns or worries that are not helping solve the current question. The act of pausing, even for a few seconds between groups of questions, signals that you are actively managing your attention rather than letting fatigue dictate the pace. Candidates who build these micro breaks into their pacing often find that clarity returns more quickly after difficult sequences. Guesses will sometimes be necessary, but they do not have to be random when guided by principle checks and likelihood reasoning. A structured guess considers which option best matches core ideas, such as least privilege, defense in depth, evidence-based decision-making, and regulatory alignment. Likelihood reasoning then asks which scenario the exam designers are more likely to reward, a choice that ignores governance and documentation, or one that strengthens traceability and controlled risk. Even when knowledge feels partial, this approach converts an uncertain moment into a disciplined judgment rather than a coin flip. Over the course of many questions, educated guesses grounded in recurring principles tend to tilt results in your favor. Keeping an eye on domain balance helps ensure that effort is spread sensibly across the breadth of the exam. It is natural to prefer questions in areas of personal strength, but over-investing in comfort zones can leave weaker domains dangerously underrepresented. Periodically glancing at the question numbers or section markers, where visible, helps track whether certain topic clusters have been neglected. If a domain seems thin on attention, small adjustments in pacing or focus can be made before the end of the exam. This gentle self-monitoring supports a balanced performance that reflects overall readiness, not just depth in one or two favored areas. Logistical simplicity on exam day reduces opportunities for distractions and panic, particularly as the clock advances. Familiar routines around food, hydration, and clothing help ensure that physical discomfort does not become a recurring interruption. A steady glance at the timer, rather than constant checking, keeps awareness without amplifying anxiety about every passing minute. Obsessive review cycles, where answers are changed repeatedly without new insight, tend to erode confidence and sometimes accuracy. By keeping the routine straightforward and limiting unnecessary decisions, you leave more mental capacity for the core tasks of reading, reasoning, and eliminating distractions. Decisive commitment to answers is the final step that translates reasoning into points on the score report. As the exam draws toward its conclusion, reserving the last minutes for flagged questions with high potential impact yields better returns than reopening stable answers. This final review is less about second-guessing and more about revisiting complex scenarios with a fresh, time-boxed look. Once the best available choice is selected, committing to it and resisting further tinkering supports both accuracy and emotional composure. Candidates who treat their final answers as decisions made under known constraints, rather than as guesses to regret, tend to leave the exam with clearer recall and less doubt. A brief mental mini-review near the end of preparation can cement these tactics into a coherent playbook. The pattern includes triage from question 1, disciplined reading of stems, systematic elimination of distractors, and pacing that uses time boxes rather than panic. It also reflects deliberate resets when focus slips, thoughtful, educated guessing when certainty is out of reach, and conscious balancing of domains across the exam. Confident commitment to answers, especially during the final minutes, rounds out the rhythm. Each element does not stand alone. It links to the others, forming a repeatable sequence that can be recalled under stress. Crushing exam day with calm, repeatable tactics ultimately means treating execution as a skill you rehearse, not a test of raw nerve. For an exam candidate, that skill bridges months of study with a few hours that decide the result, translating preparation into performance. A useful way to anchor this is to print a mental checklist of your exam routine, from arrival and pacing through triage, resets, and final review. The next deliberate step is to rehearse timed sections under conditions that mimic the real exam as closely as possible, allowing this checklist to move from theory into muscle memory. As these rehearsals accumulate, the exam becomes less of an unknown event and more of a familiar sequence that you have already executed successfully many times. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.